Professor Akram here, and in today's tutorial, we're going to explore spline modeling. When it comes to creating 3D models, there's really two methods of choice to use. There is box modeling, and there is spline modeling. And in this case, we're going to look at spline modeling. Spline modeling is where you take two-dimensional shapes and use modifiers to give them height and depth to create a 3D model. So inside of 3ds Max over in our Create tab, you'll notice that we have the Create tab, and then we also have the Shapes tab here. And our Shapes tab, if we click on that, will take us to our spline objects. And again, as I said before, splines are just simply two-dimensional shapes. So if I click something, let's say circle, and draw it, all I have created is a two-dimensional circle. It's just an outline. And I can do the same thing with a variety of different shapes. I have a shape like star here, and I can kind of create the way that star looks. Now, all of these shapes have points on them, which are known as the vertices. If I select a spline and I go to the Modify tab, from the Modify tab, you'll see that it'll say the standard spline that I created. In this case, I've created a star, and I have some settings that can change the points of the star and some information here. But I want to change the rudimentary lines and points of the spline. So I need to convert this from a built-in shape to a spline. So I'm going to go down to my modifier list, and I'm going to turn this into an editable spline. When I do that in the modifier list, you'll see that I have an option to check vertices, segments, and spline. So spline is the entire shape. If I click on any segment of it, it will actually select the whole spline because I have spline selected. If I click segment, segments are the lines between points, so I can manipulate the individual lines. Now, if I click vertices, vertices are the points between lines, and I can click any one of these vertices, right click, do move, and I can move these. So now I can even create more complex shape from the original shape that I had first started out with. So this is one method of creating splines. If I go back to my Create tab, another method is to sort of create a freeform spline with the line tool. So the line tool has you pick a point and then click another point, do another point, do another point, just like connect the dot. And I can enclose that spline by simply clicking on the first point again. It's going to ask me if I want to close the spline, and I press yes. This spline, as you can see, is very rigid. It's all angular parts. But I can also create nice shape from these lines using a tool which is called the bezier curve. If you've ever played with Adobe Illustrator, this is very similar to working with like the pen tool. So with the line tool selected, I can click on a point, and then I can click and hold down the next point. And that will allow me to create a curve as I am creating my shape. So I click, hold down for the next point, and I create some interesting shapes this way. Also note that if you're using the line tool, if I go to the Modify tab and my line object does not actually need an editable spline applied to it. It actually reads itself as an editable spline, and it already has the different selection modes on here. So once I've drawn my spline, if I need to change or revise any of these points, I can go to the vertice option, click on a vertice, and in this case, this one is angular, and I want to make it more of a curve. So I'm going to right click on that spline, and one of the options that I have is to make it a bezier or bezier corner. And I'll just do bezier here for this example. And you can see it creates a point here for me to use these little handlebars. Again, very similar to Adobe Illustrator and the pen tool. But I can use these handlebars to adjust the shaping of the spline. And once we have our two-dimensional shape, we can then apply modifiers to change the shape into a three-dimensional shape. Now that you have an understanding of how splines work, let's go ahead and provide an example of when you would want to use this. Here I have a tasty image of bacon that I want to create a 3D model of. Now, I could do a 3D model, a rectangle, do some manipulation, but instead, this is a very organic shape, and I have this top view image as a reference that I could potentially just sort of trace this out in 2D and then turn it into a 3D object. So in the Create tab under Spline, I'm going to hit the Line tool. Now, I could zoom in really closely and really go detail-wise into how I'm tracing out this image. But I'm going to actually undo this. And one of the things that you can do when you're in the Spline Line tool, if you're moving parts, you can actually hit the backspace button to undo some of your points. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm actually going to do a really rough outline. And I'm going to try to do this with as few vertice points as possible. And I'm going to click and hold to create some very simple curves. Again, you want to keep your 3D models as lightweight as possible. So the more lines and segments you create, the more data that the file or object holds. So to make it lightweight as possible, we're going to try to do this with as few vertices as possible. I'm just clicking, and I'm clicking and dragging to create a few curves. So I can come in and refine this later, which is really what you want to do. I'm just trying to get in the basic outline here. And click on the yellow dot, which is my first dot, and it's going to ask me to close my spline. All right, now that I have this outline, I'm going to go to the Modify tab, and I'm going to go to my vertices, and then this is where I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to refine these. I'm going to click this first part, this first one. I'm going to do a bezier to kind of get this to be a little bit nicer of a point. I'm going to do that for the next one as well, because I didn't get them all quite as curved as I wanted. Now, over here, you'll notice that this line looks like it may be a little twisted. So if I convert this to a bezier, I have my little points, my little handles that come out. One of the biggest issues that you may run into is accidentally spinning these handlebars around, and you'll get this little twist in your spline. And if you zoom way out, you'll never notice that. Like, I don't notice that. You gotta zoom in and make sure that this does not happen. Because if you've got this twist in your two-dimensional spline, it will not model correctly in 3D space. You want to make sure that you have no twists. Now, sometimes if you've got a twist in your spline and you keep moving, it's just too hard. You're not able to get it on spline. One of the things that you can also do in spline edit mode, if I scroll down in my Modify tab over here, is I can change my spline settings here. So one thing that I can do is I can hit delete and delete that spline altogether. So now that spline is gone, and it fixed any of the curve issues. It smoothed everything out. But let's say that I deleted it, but I still really need another vertice right here, because maybe I need another point of curve or angle or whatever the case may be. So in the Modify tab, I have an option to refine, and refine just simply allows me to add a new point, even if I hadn't had one there before, to the spline. Now keep in mind, when you have refine turned on, it is still turned on until you turn it off. So anything that I do right now, I'm creating more points. So I need to turn refine back off, come back to my point here, and now I can come in here and refine this shape to how I want it. Now again, you can put in a lot of detail in your spline modeling. It's just up to you how detailed you feel like the object needs. I think for this case, I think I'm pretty happy with this outline. I'm not going to do too much more finagling. I think, oh, right here, I'm going to take this corner point and make that a bezier curve, just so that we have a little softer edge there. All right, so I'm pretty happy with my spline. Once you're happy with it, you're going to turn off vertice mode so that it's no longer selecting the points, and if I click on it, it's selecting the whole thing. This is at the point where you can now turn this object into a 3D model. I'm going to go back into the all viewport mode so that I can see this in all views, and you can see my little white line above the image that is the spline that I created. And I'm going to give this object some height by adding an extrude on it. An extrude just adds height. So in the modifier tab with the spline turned on, I'm going to go to the modifier drop down and I'm going to find extrude. Immediately, when we put an extrude on a spline, it shades it in because this tells you it's not just an outline. It now has surfaces on it. I don't even have really a height. It's almost like a plane in a cutout of this outline. So what I want to do in the modifier tab is I want to go ahead and give this spline some height. And so now if I go into my perspective view, you can see that I gave my spline some height. And you can add however much of a height that you want, however thick you like your bacon, you can give it some height. Now, another item with the extrude are segments. Segments has to do with the transition of height. Whether you have those vertice points in between each segment as you go up the height. Now, I only have a segment of one, so I don't have any. And if I zoom in on the left view here, you can see that I just have straight lines going up. But if I change that segment to say 2, I now have a horizontal line through here. And depending on how you want to manipulate your object later, you may consider adding a few segments. But just as we were talking about earlier with the spline and the vertice points, the more segments, the more vertices your object has, the larger the file data of that model is. So especially when it comes to game modeling, you want to keep your models as lightweight as possible. And if you're never going to do any real manipulation to the edges of your object, you're never going to need to pull it in or do any refinement like that, then one segment is probably all you need. So that is a quick example of creating a spline, editing vertices, adding curves, and extruding your model into a 3D object. I hope you found this lesson informative. And don't forget to check out other lessons and tutorials on the channel. So what are you waiting for? Get creative today.